Good morning. My name is Josh Atwell, and I am here to talk with you a bit with my tech talk to talk about DevOps with PowerCLI and Desired State Configurator. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what DevOps is. If you've been attending VMworld this year, you should have seen at some point in time a large space where they've had the entire week full of content around methodologies and principles of DevOps, the tools that are used to enable DevOps. And most commonly when you talk to folks, you'll hear them talk about tools like Puppet or Chef, Ansible, Jenkins, configuration management tools. Well, what I wanted to do briefly is to talk about how Microsoft is also in this space with their PowerShell Desired State Configuration. PowerShell DSC was released with PowerShell 4.0. It was available on Server 2012. It was a service that you can add to the system. It's very simple to do. It actually takes a single command. And by doing so, you create this framework that allows you to work and function very much like you would in a Puppet environment, where you're being declarative about what you want the identity and the profile of an application or a Windows system to be. Now, declarative state configuration is very different than imperative scripting, where what you're doing is you're writing commandlets and you're piping information to get a net result, that you're including all of your logic, you're creating loops, you're doing conditional checks, and all of your error handling and things have to be written within the script itself. Declarative state is different because all of that work, all of the logic, all of the methods that are making execution actually are part of the underlying system, part of the framework, DSC. What you as an administrator are required to then do is only provide what you want that profile to be, what configurations you want, what applications you want installed, what resources or roles that need to be installed on the Windows system. And then also if you want to execute additional scripts, which can include PowerCLI, so that as you go and implement that, you also want to make incremental changes to the virtualization environment itself. The common use cases for PowerShell DSC are just the same as you would have with Puppet and Chef. The intent being to be able to define an identity or define a profile and ensure that that profile is maintained, right, and consistent, and being able to monitor that and understand that if somebody makes a change, that could be reported back, or if you want, have it automatically be changed back to the setting that it should be, right? And when you look at an environment where you're continuously trying to develop and deploy and have rapid agility, being able to ensure that you have that consistency is vitally important. And then even in a non-DevOps environment, or in parts of your environment where you wouldn't consider that you've adopted this high agility and rapid implementation profile, you're still able to take advantage of PowerShell DSC in order to ensure that the applications may meet certain configurations that you need for security or compliance, or mainly just to ensure that you have fewer opportunities for failure. With PowerShell DSC, I've already mentioned that you can manage and implement roles and features, but you can also stop and start services. So if you are performing a task that requires a restart of services, which we all know is very common and a requirement, you have that capability to roll that right into the DSC configuration file. You can deploy software, so if there's applications that need to come along that are the dependencies for your overall application stack, whether it's a web server, maybe you're using Node or something like that, you can have that, and then as I mentioned, you can run PowerShell scripts as well. From a vSphere perspective, there has not been much in the way of DSC resources available to the community or to the ecosystem at large. Nobody is. What's that? I'm getting to that, Luke. And it's kind of frustrating if you think about it, because VMware and PowerCLI everything that you need is there in order to accomplish it, just the resources weren't built. Well, fortunately, Luke Deakins, in his great wisdom and capability, he has actually produced some DSC resources. And I'm just kind of giving a screen grab to show that he has written code and that it is available. But one thing I wanted to point out is that when you are applying a DSC resource, you're doing more than just saying, this is what needs to happen. You're actually going and saying, what is it there? Implement changes and test to make sure that it is accurate. Okay? That is taking a lot of burden off you as an administrator, because now you have the opportunity to leverage DSC to manage your application and your operating system, and also to the infrastructure itself. Right? You have the opportunity to ensure that your ESXi hosts have the right configuration, that your virtual machine has the right configuration, that the network settings that are supporting those virtual machines. I won't speak to everything that Luke has included in his resource kit, but the nice thing about DSC Resources is there's really a very low barrier to entry to create and build your own. It's actually something I'll be working on for my company later this year in an attempt to extend that ability, so that if you are in an environment where you're trying to improve things and be more agile and deliver better to the business, you can implement this technology. Another side note that I want to add is that if you're using, for instance, Puppet, and you're using vSphere, the vSphere module for Puppet, you can actually call that from PowerShell DSC. They have interoperability, and the other way around. If you're using DSC, you want to call Puppet, you can do so. If you're using Puppet primarily and you want to call DSC to perform specific tasks, you can do so. Microsoft has done a very good job of working with Puppet and with Puppet users because, well, I believe there's a lot of people at Microsoft who are Puppet users. That's speculation on my part, but based on the characteristics, and if you look at PowerShell DSC, it looks very comparable. It behaves very similarly, and you build your configurations very similarly. I was going to show a demo, and then I was reminded that I don't have time for that. So what I will talk about, though, is another use case that I think is really interesting. And when I was working on the DevOps for VMware Administrator book, I was trying to find a use case for a VMware administrator who may be working in a DevOps environment or just looking to gain better efficiencies in their traditional environment. And why would they care about PowerShell DSC if there's not a vSphere DSC resource, right? It's not there, and they don't feel like building one. So why would they care? How might they leverage it? So the use case I came up with is, what if your company has a DMZ, a demilitarized zone, where you have public-facing systems that service web services, VPN access, you name it, whatever your DMZ is doing. Most companies have that type of environment. Now, when you're using something like DSC, you'll have a pool server that sits there and that can manage all the configurations. Does anybody want to put a pool server in their demilitarized zone? No, that would be a huge threat footprint that you would have to deal with. Now, the alternative, of course, is you can open up the necessary ports to ensure that that communication is done, but who wants to talk to the networking team about messing with the firewall, right? I certainly don't. So I've decided to get a little bit creative, and I said, what if I just make the DSC calls through invoke VM script? And I thought, that is a really clever idea. I'm going to try it. Fail. It actually does not work. The challenge that you run into is invoke VM script really only allows you to run a single line. And PowerShell DSC configurations are multiple lines, right? And so you can't just make that call, even if you have a configuration manager on the Windows system that you're making the call to. Well, that's a bit of a challenge. Now I'm stuck with only one line. I said, well, what if the MOF file, the configuration file that is built in order to create that configuration on the system, what if it resided locally on the system? It's like, well, I can programmatically copy files through the VMware tools. I can copy that file to a specific location. I can define that location. I can define the script file, copy it to a known location on the VM, and then use invoke VM script. You see in the last line there, use invoke VM script to call that script and launch LCM and force it to apply the configuration. So now what I've effectively done is allowed you to centrally manage PowerShell, use DSC to build your MOF file within your main environment, and then copy it through the VMware tools into your demilitarized zone. As long as you have appropriate credentials for the operating system, for the guest OS, and for the ESXi host, for the virtualization layer, you are able to actually copy that in there and implement the DSC and make sure those configurations stick. What it doesn't do well in this current iteration is be able to report back to the pool server that things have changed. So what you would end up wanting to do then is create perhaps a scheduled task that periodically would go through and do an invoke VM script to run a script that resides on the local host in order to check that configuration and then apply the configuration changes if you need. It is not the most elegant solution in the world, but it was a use case that I actually was fortunate enough to run into an individual who has actually applied this, and he says it works really, really well, which made me feel really good because I don't have a demilitarized zone and I don't really have this condition, so it was really nice to see that it does apply. So big takeaway, moving forward, take an opportunity to look into PowerShell DSC, Desired State Configuration. The Windows Management Framework 5 just went into production preview. That is going to include a new iteration of DSC that is going to be much more robust, much more capable, and I think Luke would attest, much easier to develop against versus the 4.0, a much more mature implementation. And take a look at it, and also with the integrations that it has with Puppet and being able to leverage it throughout your entire environment. And hopefully next year at VMworld, you'll start seeing a lot more content around that to really demonstrate a lot of agility on the infrastructure side by leveraging this powerful tool. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. Have a great day.